Hi, and welcome to Art Lab, a podcast dedicated to conversations on visual culture with me, Kamayani. Today, we have with us a doctoral student of cinema studies, Rakesh Sengupta, whose work has been recognized for its significance in the area of scholarship on the history of screenwriting. Often, work produced in academia needs to take the form of a book before it's introduced and discussed in the public context of ideas and opened up to non-academic enthusiasts. And often, even those books that do get attention end up almost exclusively being by already established scholars. So I thought that it might be an interesting idea for Artalap to take up essays by early career academics as a point of entry and conversation. Of course, I hope to invite scholars who've contributed authoritative works and ideas to the discourse on the visual arts as well. And I think that providing a platform through which both well-known and upcoming academics unpack their work in various modes can be just as illuminating as traditional formats like colloquia, seminars, and panel discussions. The difference, of course, being that most of these latter formats aren't available or indeed pitched for public engagement. So this is a kind of corrective in that regard. On today's episode, Rakesh and I are going to discuss his award-winning essay, Writing from the Margins of Media, Screenwriting Practice and Discourse During the First Indian Talkies, published in the December 2018 issue of Bioscope, number 9.2. We talk about the way in which the lack of script archives dictated the methods of research, how the vocation of screenwriting propelled fantasies of self-improvement and socioeconomic ascendancy in the 1930s and 40s, and the way in which the study of early cinema has been revitalized in the contemporary context of OTT and web programming. We also have some lovely anecdotes about serendipitous discoveries of forgotten Indian cinema scripts in other corners of the world. Let me introduce you to him. Rakesh is a PhD candidate in South Asian Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, that is SOAS, University of London. His doctoral project on early screenwriting practices in Indian cinema is an interdisciplinary engagement with film history, media ethnography, print culture, and critical theory. Rakesh's research article in Bioscope, the one that we talk about today in detail, was awarded the Best Journal Article by Screenwriting Research Network and also received High Commendation for Screen's Annette Kuhn debut essay prize, which is one of the reasons that I thought it would be a good idea to have a conversation with him on Artalab. Hi and welcome to Artalab, Rakesh. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Kamaini. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you again for having me. And as you've mentioned, I am your first academic guest and also an early career academic. And I've also really enjoyed the previous conversations. And I'm really looking forward to this one. Thank you so much.
Before we continue, I'd like to let our listeners know how to access the material accompanying our conversation. To view the images and other material being referenced and discussed in the episode, click on the link in the show notes to access the guide. You can also find the link to the guide for each episode in our Instagram captions and tweets. Rakesh and I became acquainted with each other through Sarai, which is the media studies program at CSDS, New Delhi, where I was a research associate and Rakesh was our library resident. He was working on his doctoral research. And we had a lot of lunches together as a group of co-workers. So we ended up having a lot of conversations during those lunches. And so in some sense, I think of this as an extension of that. So, Rakesh, just to set up the broader contours of your interdisciplinary scholarship, I thought it might be a good idea for you to talk a bit about how you arrived at this particular, juncture of classical film history, ethnography, media studies, media archaeology, and area studies. What in your training and, maybe even pursuit of personal interest led you to this inquiry about the literary and theatrical infrastructural basis, if you like, of early Indian cinema?
So I am formally trained in literary studies, specifically English literature, for 7 years. So I did my bachelor's, I did my master's and my MPhil in English literature. I did my bachelor's from Calcutta University, where the syllabus is very canonical. So I think I grew very averse to that kind of literature that was available to me. I did benefit a lot but that is also the time when I started watching a lot of European cinema. So these two things were happening at the same time for me. Then I moved to Delhi for my for my post graduation in Delhi University, and also my MPhil later on in Jamia Millia Islamia. And people within English literature circles would know this quite well. So in Delhi, English literature functions almost as a de facto cultural studies department, where we study everything under the universe, almost, not literally everything,
Right.
but almost everything, under the broader rubric of text. So I had this interest in cinema for the longest time. And then I also had the freedom to actually study these things within the department. So while I was being formally trained in literary studies in some ways, literary theory, cultural studies, I was also self-training, getting self-trained in film studies. So that is how this happened. And now I'm doing my PhD in an area studies department, specifically South Asian studies, of course, under a film historian and a literary historian. So again, there's this intermediate tussle that's going on, even in my mentoring, right? So that is why screenwriting emerged as this practice, this process that really brings the two worlds together for me, literature and cinema. So if you're asking for an academic genealogy, I think that's where it lies for me.
Cinema has all of these sensorial components, and the form and language and grammar of cinema is in some sense medium specific, like it is with all media forms, right? I mean, not again, and your research proves it's never entirely independent. I mean, these are all interdependent kind of linkages, and there's a lot of incest, mediatic incest. But at the same time, you find that people come with this kind of training that can be quite conventional, and as you said, also orthodox in some ways. And then to encounter film studies, a discipline which is still somewhat nascent in South Asia, in India. So I find that also interesting that you talk about literary studies as this kind of almost inevitable predecessor to an education or a life in film studies scholarship or cinema studies scholarship. I'm just to kind of dive into your essay as well. I think I could begin, our discussion of your essay proper by quoting a couple of phrases which I think kind of capture the essence of your approach to recovering. I mean, I'm speaking crudely, to recovering a history of cinema through its verbal incarnations. And I think that I'm using the phrase verbal incarnations in a way that's quite deliberate. And we will come back to it because I have other questions, that come out of this formulation. You write that in your essay that you attempt to, quote, historicize the spectral figure of the screenwriter by engaging, quote, with this archival absence of film scripts as a heuristic rather than a handicap. So clearly, you're seeing this as a generative mode. You're taking something that might be seen as a sort of lack, and you're, sort of turning it on its head. So, do you want to talk about that?
So just to go back a little bit, so when I again, and in continuation with the previous answer of mine, so when I did my MPhil, I wrote about film adaptation, and that's something that almost every literature student also interested in cinema would eventually do, right? The reason for my shift to screenwriting was because it was giving me a very specific site, a very specific practice, and a specific process to work on. So the reason I started working on screenwriting was because of intermediality, firstly, and also because it was facilitated by my interdisciplinary training. But then I actually started doing film history. So it's one thing reading film history, and then it's another thing doing film history. So I thought, I mean, okay, I looked up the NFAI, National Film Archive of India catalog, and they
Yeah.
have listed probably thousands of scripts in their archive. So I went there expecting to be, encountering this plethora of material. And then what I found out was that these were post production documents. These were
Right.
transcripts of films that were sent to film censors. So that's when I realized, okay, maybe I've chosen the wrong topic. Film historians talk a lot about absence, but they'll still find something, right? Some traces of films. There are these difficulties, but in this particular case, it was that the very object of the subject was absolutely missing. So so I began to think more and more about it. I didn't want to give it up because I was still interested in intermediality. And I thought, why not turn this into an advantage, this crisis, this archival crisis? And in the context of this particular paper, the moment of the talkies, which is, I would say, the period of its anticipation from, say, around 1927 when it arrives in Hollywood,
Yeah.
and to its moment of arrival, actual arrival in India in 1931, this emerged as a very rich moment of discourse for me, where a lot is being written about screenwriting, because screenwriting has to be rethought. We are going to talk not just through images now, but through dialogue, through songs. And of course, we also have to be mindful that theater was sort of the dominant medium of the time. So cinema would in some ways remediate theater. So to make this shift possible, and as with everything else, when there's an anticipation of anything, there's a market that is built around it. So there's a lot of writing. Manuals come in. So I started looking at these manuals that were written. Could this be the source? It was being posited as something very promising, this field of screenwriting. These are also fictions of opportunity in some ways, right? So that really got me thinking. And then I started looking at what was actually happening in the studios. What was actually happening was the shift of,
Hmm.
like, not like a totalizing kind of shift, but a shift of some theater personnel into film studios
Hmm.
to facilitate this transition, and especially screenwriters in this case. So how do you write dialogues, how do you write songs, how do you write stories where there are words? You get people from theater, and this happened in Hollywood as well. And this gave me the encouragement to actually
Hmm.
study screenwriting without film scripts. So this is where the handicap, and I'm very apologetic about using that word now, because it's quite offensive to many people. But when I wrote that, I did not have a sense of how it might be offensive. But it turned from a disadvantage to an advantage, because I could explore things that I wouldn't have been able to explore if I had those scripts. It would have just turned into a kind of textual comparative study across the scripts and the films, if they were available in the first place. But I think epistemologically, that is a question that we still need to work out. Why,
Hmm.
why do we still think of the script as a blueprint? Why do we think of screenwriting as the composition of a script that is a blueprint? Why
Hmm.
are we so uncomfortable about songs in film narratives?
Hmm.
Why do we think they lie outside the script? So because of this archival absence, I was able to rethink
Hmm.
some of these biases, so to say, and also come up with new ways of trying to think about Bombay cinema.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting also, what you're talking about in terms of even thinking about, in terms of conceptualizing early cinema or cinema at any point of time, really. But also,
Hmm.
coming back to this fascinating kind of study that you've done of these scenario manuals that you were just talking about, right? This kind of taking up of text in cinema in this antic way, where it's not about the script, it's about all the other textual kind of circumscriptions, right? So I find that really interesting that you talked about these scenario manuals
Hmm.
as like a kind of fictions of opportunity, right? Because it's like this kind of, you know, or BMM, Bachelor of Mass Media logic, right? Like happening in the 30s, where like everyone's suddenly thinking they can get a job out of this. And it's playing on a certain kind of emergent, maybe a literate ambition or whatever, something of that kind. And you looked at memoirs of screenwriters that you mentioned in the essay. You've mentioned, you've cited first person accounts recorded in the Indian Cinematograph Committee proceedings, and then of course these scenario manuals. All of this in the absence of scripts themselves. So all of these sites sort of help draw attention to the multimedial complex, right, of literature and theatre, in which Indian cinema existed, and indeed a global complex. I was really surprised to learn that Indian screenwriters were freelancing for Hollywood projects. You mentioned this in your, in your work. Like, who are these people who are, whose labor is part of the Hollywood machinery, American cinema machinery? And you have foreign and Indian published guidebooks which are circulating widely. I'm really fascinated. Tell us more about this infrastructure, what you call a parallel pedagogical infrastructure. I mean, you touched upon it briefly, but I think there's a lot more to unpack.
Yeah, definitely, and I think it's still relevant. It's probably more relevant in the contemporary, because even if the listeners are not really aware or maybe interested in screenwriting per se, they will definitely know that screenwriting manuals are very popular in the book market, right? And there's sometimes they're the bestsellers. There are these screenwriting conferences that happen, and some of those screenwriting gurus, like say Sitfield or Robert McKee, they have not some of them have not even written a single script, but
Yeah,
they're
exactly.
somehow these kind of self-help figures as well. So I think there's a kind of intensification of that discourse that I was telling you about, of, there's this fiction of opportunity, there's this, you can become. So some of the Hollywood manuals that I've looked at, and this is in reference to a particular, what you call a clearing house, where you keep a lot of scripts and then you make films from some of them. So
Right.
this one was called the Palmer Photoplay Corporation, and the kind of, I have mentioned it probably in one of the footnotes.
You have, yeah.
So and the kind of rhetoric that they use, it's like, even if you don't get a job, you'll end up becoming a better person. That's literally what they say. So this relationship between screenwriting discourse and self-help discourse is something that emerged absolutely serendipitously. And while I was also told not to go too deep into it, because I started looking at histories of unemployment in India, and I looked at that particular period from through the 1930s, when these manuals were extremely popular. And it turned out that this was also a time of peak industrial age unemployment, also
Mm-hmm.
recession in the US. So that had certain effects on the Indian landscape. So this was also a time of peak unemployment, and there were so many surveys that were written on the unemployed of educated,
Mm-hmm.
English educated young men.
Yeah,
That was the category. So again, English becomes very important, because all these manuals are written in English,
right.
right? So there is a desire to read about cinema, there is acute unemployment, and then there's this growing market of cinema which will not really take in outsiders. It works through its own networks. I mean, this is, again, it's something that's very true in the contemporary.
I know we were being facetious about the BMM logic, but actually that's kind of not so different, in the sense that there is a kind of neoliberal moment post 91, right? Where suddenly you have a mushrooming of mass media education as kind of something that the middle class can access. And again, maybe obtain a better, secure a better life. So there's something to this kind of logic of financial, recession, unemployment, and preying upon, by commercial firmaments and establishments on people's, desire to be upwardly mobile, in a context which makes it very difficult to be so.
So, I mean, yeah, so we have to think of early cinema as a commodity in its purest form. It was traveling, right? The earliest forms of film had to travel. The people who made them, sometimes the people who even developed these equipment, had to travel with those films. So this is cinema in its purest form. The networks, the infrastructures are not properly developed. It's very human in a sense, and that's something that I was also trying to look at through this idea of intermediality. I mean, there's are, of course, abstract theoretical ways
Mhm.
of studying intermediality as exchange between media forms and so on,
Yeah,
and through remediation, looking at the old in the new and new in the old and so on. But who facilitates these shifts? They're people. And to go back to your question, and sometimes
mhm.
during these shifts, there's a lot else that goes on in the
Yeah,
background that contributes more to, say, a sociological understanding of cinema, even if not aesthetic and industrial. But I thought that was also very important, because screenwriting is also very, very aspirational, because it's not film direction, right? You might want to become a film director, but you know that you don't have the tools to do it. It's a difficult undertaking, both artistically and commercially, and you don't need to be in certain networks. You Most people have no idea about how to
yeah,
direct a film. I mean, at least in the pre-cell phone age. But you know how to write. And most of us in schools are taught how to write short stories and essay writing and things like that. So this is a bit like
mhm.
that, tapping into that market of people who have just learned English, and
Yeah,
they want to use that
to
ability
improve their lives.
to
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
their fullest.
It should be like the script writer who optioned his script, like the monk who sold his Ferrari, that kind of logic.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
It's really funny, actually. I was just reminded of the fact that even in, like, when you talk about, like recovering cinematic objects through all of these indexes, let's say the script form, I was reminded how, when we were younger, I mean, you and I are about the same age, when we were younger, pre-torrent, the torrent era, you couldn't just watch films online, right? So what ended up happening was I discovered like databases of scripts online, And then I would just like read all these Hollywood scripts when I was like 12, 13, whatever, because I couldn't watch these movies. And I was just reading the scripts and imagining. And then years later, I would watch the film and be like, acha, this is kind of what I'd imagined, or like completely a departure. So it's also interesting to kind of work with these objects in that way, where so much of it is also your fantasy and projection, even as a scholar. Yeah, I just thought that was also kind of a strange part of conducting research of this kind.
Certainly, I think it's a what you're hinting at is a form of like a vicarious form of pleasure. When you don't have access to the film, you can look at the script which is readily available online. So think of it like in that time,
Yeah,
you don't really have access to the industry, but by reading about cinema through this language of opportunity, fiction of opportunity, you are vicariously living your dream to be in the industry. It's a very kind of
yeah,
participatory kind of pleasure in the absence of real opportunities.
yeah. And I also want to come back to my use of the phrase that I'd flagged earlier, verbal incarnation of cinema. I wasn't quite sure how else to formulate it, but the reason I used it is because words are so central. In a sense, language is so central to this understanding that you're developing of film. And especially in terms of, I was thinking of the advent of sound, as a technological factor in the making of motion pictures in India. I mean, this is an essay about the talkies. So you obviously, dialogue becomes important, and that's what you peg the theatrical turn on to, in a sense, because suddenly you have all these playwrights who've become experimental artists, in a sense, in the cinematic realm. So do you want to take up these two threads, like a sound studies sort of perspective, and the Parsi theatre as a well theorized precedent? But also, your argument is that actually there was no drastic rupture. Like, I mean, it's again a remediation. It's not something that's like cinema doesn't become this completely new entity, because for the longest time, the two are also coexisting, silent movies and talkies. So these two strands of the sound and the Parsi theatre in Bombay cinema specifically. Do you want to just talk about what this meant for film production in the 1930s?
Again, the films don't exist, but there's some writing that is available through interviews mainly that were taken, say, around the 1940s and 50s, when
Yeah,
these pioneers of talkies in India, if we can call them that, Ardeshir
yeah,
Irani, the Wadia brothers, some of these interviews were taken, and they do talk about the challenges of indoor recording versus outdoor recording, because the equipment is not really the best quality. They couldn't procure the latest equipment at times,
yeah,
and even if they did not know who would handle this kind of equipment. So they had to get a foreign technician on board. So
right,
William Deming turned out to be
right,
this person who traveled across India working in different studios, and I think he's also written something about his experiences, not necessarily in very good terms.
huh.
So yeah, so
Yeah,
I think his experience. Yeah, I don't think he had very good experiences. So there is some writing on that, but in this particular article, in this particular study, my sense is that sound was a novelty at this time.
yeah,
They were not really thinking through sound a lot. The struggle was technological and not really aesthetic. So, and they could only think of sound, I think, in terms of dialogue and songs, because the earliest talkie that is publicly available from the Wadias is Lale Yaman, which is also
ah,
available
okay, right.
on, yeah, also available on YouTube. You can sense that the focus is entirely on dialogues and sounds, because other kinds of
Hmm,
sounds are not there.
got it. Hmm,
Yeah, and the frontality is very much there
hmm,
in a film like that, because
yeah,
it's very theatrical, right? They're still
right,
working out the grammar of talkies, and they
yeah,
had to go back, even if silent
hmm,
film had developed in a particular way.
right,
And that's why there's so much writing around whether the talkies should become the norm, which is a very
right,
interesting,
yeah,
again, discourse happening around that time, which also reflects anxieties that are there in the contemporary as well.
yeah,
Will OTT replace Bollywood? Will the
yeah,
multiplex replace Bollywood,
yeah,
and so on? So there's this deep anxiety about
yeah,
whether the talkies are here to stay.
yeah,
But yeah, my sense is that it was a novelty, and they could only think of sound in terms of songs, fit in as many songs as possible. So one film, I think, had 70 songs, and I don't know how that was possible. This was in
I
1931
mean, it was
or maybe
basically
30.
just a string of songs. It was like music
Yeah,
videos, one after the
yeah,
other.
yeah. It was just like that. So
I
they
mean,
were waiting for an opportunity to break into a song, right?
right,
And yeah, so and that exchange with Parsi theater, really
Hmm.
laid the foundations of Indian cinema.
Yeah.
There are definitely other influences at play,
Hmm.
but from what I have sensed in my research, I think that that's really the foundation. And I don't mean to say that Parsi theatre is really indigenous in any essential sense of the word, because it was also building on proscenium theatre, Shakespearean theatre, and
Yeah.
so on. But it had developed a very crude way, a very South Asian or and even Southeast Asian sensibility, because it
Yeah.
also traveled outside South Asian borders,
Yeah.
and that's where these films were also distributed. So
Hmm.
Parsi, the link between sound and Parsi theatre is absolutely crucial, and I think that's also the link between the technical and the cultural, and how these how the new form of the Indian talkie emerged.
Right. Right. Yeah. And, as you've so succinctly sort of summarized, there's a lot of research by film scholars in the past couple of decades that talks about this. For instance,
Mm.
the darshanik logic, the frontal logic. I think Ashish Rajataksh has talked about it. And lots of sound scholars have talked about, sound as a kind of cinematic technology and apparatus. And yeah, there are all these linkages. It's also interesting to think about Parsi theater as a kind of not. I mean, in trying to move away from the essentialism that often inflects these discussions, one needn't forget that like there is a kind of creolization that or hybridization in a sense that emerges right in specific parts of the world, which is not to sort of take away from the global influences or cosmopolitan influences and historical kind of genealogies of any of these practices, but the fact that they kind of that area becomes a crucible is also interesting for the particular combination of things to work out and take that shape. So I think is what you're saying. So that is interesting that this kind of relationship between and all of the people that you talked about, the major studio um, guys and producers are all Parsi, whether it's Adashi Irani, whether it's the Wadias, whether it's Sorab Modi. All of these guys are kind of the big players, and they definitely come with that legacy, cultural legacy, the firm. So you know I also think like I wanted to zoom out for a minute from the essay proper and just talk a bit about the broader landscape of early Indian cinema studies. I wanted to discuss the historiography with you as a scholar yourself, and how you locate your work in that landscape. As we noted when we had our discussion last, that there hasn't been as much work as there should be, in a sense, on this period of Indian history for all of these reasons that we've been talking about. And a big part of that is the lack of sort of extant material, right? Which can be very discouraging. I mean, you yourself had a moment of sort of concern and anxiety regarding whether you should follow this trail. So one theme that recurs across the work of some of the eminent scholars in this field is that of methodological innovation in the absence of this official archive. And I think Indian cinema scholars we have a very, like most scholars of film perhaps around the world, have a very strange psychosexual relationship with the archive. It's like everyone's talking about the lack constantly. and and I just think we should talk about some of the people who've done work, whether it's Kaushik Bhaumik, who worked on early Indian cinema like 20 years ago, right? And he's drawn from the constructs of urban planning and the logic of the bazaar, or whether it's Priya Jayakumar, who's discussed cinema made in India at a continuum with colonial works produced in this area, or even Debashi's Mukherjee's use of the concept of the scandal, for instance, to analyze gendered subjectivities. And then of course her recent work, which she talks about labor uses it as a conceptual mode to sort of articulate in the workings of the Bombay film industry. So all of these people have tried to, have had to be maverick, and you have had to be. So how do you depart from or concur with these scholars is a question that I wanted to ask, because it's such a small field in a sense. There are all these conversations that all of you guys are having at various levels. Yeah, and there's bound to be disagreements in methodology, or even agreements, or like you're referring to each other's work all the time. So tell us a bit about that. Like, how do you think of your work in that complex of people?
That's a great question, Kamaini. And because I'm not sure if the audience would be familiar with the field of Indian film history, I should mention that it's an extremely rich field. So their work has been the ones that you have mentioned. Debashri Mukherjee, her work on the female figure in early Bombay cinema, how things like rumors worked,
Yeah.
and in the absence of an archive,
Yeah.
what can something like a rumor tell us?
And again, through print, right? Film magazines, gossip magazines.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. So what can something like a rumor,
Mm.
which is largely, I think, ignored.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not really empirically reliable, but she turns it around
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah.
So I think that's similar to how I'm also trying to methodologically reorient the disadvantage into an advantage,
Yeah.
right? Then you have also mentioned Priya Kumar, whose work I think is absolutely
Yeah.
fantastic. Then there's Kaushik Bhaumik.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still amazing that that book hasn't come out.
It's a shame.
Yeah, I did meet him once, and after our long chat, I asked him quite categorically why he had not published, and he said, I'm still working on the conclusion."
Yeah.
I don't know if he was being sarcastic or something, but
No, I feel like I keep telling him, you should have a PR approved answer now. It's to the discredit of the academic publishing firmament, right? That Kaushik's work, which at one level is so, he wrote it 2 decades ago. This podcast should be like a pressure, like, should pressure him into like pushing for this.
I really hope that happens, because I mean, and maybe it didn't. I mean, maybe they didn't value it at that time. I'm
Yeah.
sure there is a very
Yeah.
significant academic book market for. I mean, you can see this with Bombay Hustle, right?
There's a renewed interest for sure. I mean, yeah, I agree. And maybe it's like you'll talk about it, but maybe it's also the new media kind of anxieties and paranoia, no? Like that's creating that moment because suddenly the web and the OTT platforms are creating a sort of new relationship to cinema and what it means.
Absolutely. And I mean, in a sort of tongue in cheek way, maybe print also has to show that it is not going obsolete. So it has to bring cinema. And I don't know, maybe there's something intermediate going on there as well.
Very meta.
So definitely, I've benefited a lot from their scholarship. In addition, I would also think of Ravi Vasudevan's work on
Of course, yes.
the 1950s socials, because he's doing work in 1989,
Yeah,
and yeah, and that's just incredible. I don't know what
yeah,
kind of academic acceptance there was for cinema. Then there's also Rachel Dwyer on mythologicals. So I'm just thinking of genre work that has happened.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I found it extremely interesting, although she doesn't really call it an archaeology in any sense. But in her book, Filming the Gods, she makes it a study of stardom as well towards the end.
Yeah,
So, how stardom emanates from this popularity of mythologicals, because stars are like gods in India, right?
yeah,
So, she makes that linkage without explicitly calling it an archaeology. Then
yeah, of
there's Rosie Thomas's
course.
fantastic book on Bombay before Bollywood, because
Yeah.
again, she's moving away from both the socials and the mythologicals and looking at Orientals,
Mhm.
so Arabian Nights and so on. Then I think there's only one genre left, that's action cinema, and there's again fantastic work by Valentina Vitali on
Yeah,
it,
of course.
looking at the conditions of the production of action cinema in the 1930s with the stunt women, and then with figures like Dara Singh and so on.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
exchange between the wrestling community and cinema. I mean, these are fascinating linkages that they draw upon. And one of my favorites is definitely Sudhir Mahadevan's work,
oh yes.
yeah, looking at the origins of Indian cinema, yeah, and kind of disaggregating that whole media scape
Yeah,
across traveling showmen, bioscopes, print culture, photography, and that's just such a brilliant constellation that he puts together.
yeah.
And also, I think one of the central arguments in his book was something called the obviation of obsolescence,
Yes, absolutely.
which I think is a wonderful heuristic for us to work. Yeah, because we have to understand that new media and old media, the way it's conceptualized in the West, it's more of a kind of replacement, displacement kind of.
Whereas here you find multi-temporal kind of logics to the
Absolutely,
media forms, and things coexist
absolutely.
all the time, or they become or they get reworked.
Yeah,
And even till today, right? So to think of even things like pre-cinematic technologies or proto-cinematic technologies as not just precursors in this kind of anterior sense, but as media forms that continue to animate newer media technologies, and this troubling of what is old and what is new, that in a kind of, and he's I also thought like the way he set it up as like cinema being an intermedia, being a kind of techno material infrastructural mode in and of itself was really interesting, because then you can bring in all of these what you described as like constellations, right? And use them to generate new insights about what was happening. And actually, that's great that you brought it up, because I was going to ask you about this kind of intermedial, I don't want to say turn, but like kind of, right? I mean, at one level, we know, as you know this, and early cinema scholars have always had to contend with intermediality. It's not possible to really do a study of early cinema anywhere in the world, I think, without that sensibility. But what do you think? Like in the past few years, you've seen like a more kind of committed sort of delineation of this. I mean, maybe you disagree, but I think so. What do you think?
No, no, I definitely agree. I think intermediality is a very important, not just concept, but also a methodology
Yeah,
that film historians in South Asia, outside South Asia, have used quite extensively. And it's provided very rich dividends clearly, both not just historical and empirical, but also conceptual, because
yeah,
it's reorienting us to think about the fundamental question, the question that sort of founded in some senses film studies is what is cinema, right? The classic Andre Bazin question. And Andre Bazin had a very different answer to this. He thought about cinema as this teleological movement of the arts, right?
yeah,
Something that the idea came before the invention, that it was predestined. So there was like it's predestination and
yeah. Very Abrahamic, and yeah, yeah,
yeah. So all of that is there, and within the Western kind of framework of thinking around film and media itself, this has been turned around completely.
yeah,
Scholars like Tom Gunning and then there's Noel Birch and Andre Gridrot. They've just opened cinema up completely.
yeah,
They've shown how cinema was not supposed to be a narrative and not medium specific as well. So
yeah,
it was early cinema is this site when you don't really know what is going on because you
yeah.
don't know how to market cinema. Again, I am going back to the commerce of it rather than the aesthetic.
But it's so true. Yeah,
Yeah. So you don't know how to pitch cinema to audiences. Do you call it literature? Because one of the things that I have studied in my thesis as well is this category of boi in the Bengali cinematic landscape. So growing up, we use the term boi for cinema as well, which actually means book. So
oh,
we
okay.
called both books and films boi,
Uh-huh.
and that, I mean, now nobody talks like that anymore, but I mean, it got me thinking, why do we call it boi? Because I think it was marketed in a particular way in Calcutta,
Mm,
right? And I mean Calcutta essentially because of the new theaters and other
yeah,
kinds of
yeah,
high cultural
mm,
associations that they had. So they don't know how to pitch it, right? So intermediality through Sudhir Mahadevan, through Stephen Hughes, who has done amazing work on
Tamil cinema.
Tamil cinema,
Yeah,
Tamil music, and sort of again disaggregated Tamil music across cinema, print, because songbooks are also extremely popular at that time,
yeah,
and also theater. So songs are being made for theater, and then they are made for films,
yeah,
and how it creates this very confusing media landscape. Then there's Ravikant's work as well
of
on
course.
film, print, and radio, again, which is confusing all these boundaries. So I think for me, especially, intermediality has been extremely, extremely useful, and not just from what I have read from, say, theories of remediation and the kind of discourse that is already available
Yeah,
in Western scholarship, convergence culture, and so on, Henry Jenkins,
yeah,
but also to root that in a particular location like India, because medium specificity, it's one thing to just challenge medium specificity, but it is also important to be site specific,
yeah,
and not in an indigenous kind of autochthonous way,
yeah,
not in an essentialist way, but to point out how there's a tension between how media forms arrive. Because let's be honest about it. There's very little indigenous media, so to say, in the 20th century, right?
yeah,
It's mainly traveling media, I
yeah,
would call it. But then it doesn't just diffuse itself into the subcontinent. It is there is a kind of negotiation that
yeah,
happens. There are certain actors that are left out. It could be the amateur screenwriters that I'm talking about. It could be a figure like the Munshi,
yeah.
who is a part of actually early modern Mughal scribal culture,
Mm,
becomes a language teacher in colonial language learning institutions, also becomes a dialogue writer in film studios.
yeah,
How does he negotiate with this scientific, script oriented screenwriting, where you have to be very meticulous? You have to even type your scripts. So, somebody who's
mm,
embedded in scribal culture, I mean, how does this negotiation happen? So, I think intermediality opens up all these questions in very, very profound ways for me, not just conceptually, but also methodologically and empirically as well.
yeah, yeah. I'm also thinking about the way, since you invoked the figure of the Munshi, I was thinking about, and scribal culture itself being so sort of casted in India. thinking of caste as a very important mode, or like axis along which to track the movement of Indian cinemas, right? I mean, even with Debashi's work on like her book, Bombay Hustle, that was one of the things that I was really curious about. Like, because if you're talking about laboring bodies, let's say, and the moment you do that in the subcontinent, you can't escape the question of caste. I mean, even like, who gets to write, who gets to fantasize about mobility through writing. All of those questions become very central and key. Who gets to be a scriptwriter? And so, again, one of the things I'm personally very interested in as a student of cinema is also to think about aesthetics in terms of caste. One of my pet theses and like interests is thinking about Indian cinema as basically a feudal caste-based kind of, a business. And it's all, Khatri and mercantile caste people, the Kapoors and the Johars, who control the capital and the infrastructural logic. So, how are we not talking about what the aesthetic imagination of these caste groups is that finds its way onto the screen, right? And like also then through these scripted forms, like it's interesting to think about a caste ethnography also of all of these people who are involved, right? So, what do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, again, like you mentioned, the commerce is handled by the Kapoors and Johars.
Yeah,
The cultural side of it is handled by the Boses, the Chatterjees, and the Rays.
the Brahmins and the Kayasts,
Yes.
yeah, and which again, the Munshi figure itself, it's a kind of it's a particular kind of category that
Yeah.
continues from the ancient to the medieval to the modern era, so to speak. So,
Yeah.
and what does that tell you, right?
Yeah. I mean, the Munshi. I mean, there was a time when Brahmins also used to be Munshis,
Hmm.
because that was the creme de la creme job, right?
Yeah.
In the Mughal court, being the court scribe. So there was a time when Brahmins used to learn Persian and try and be
As for
court scribes.
me,
But
how dare you?
and
Yeah.
then it changed gradually, because the moment they became language teachers, which was quite looked down upon, it became predominantly from the Hindu side caste,
Hmm.
and then from and predominantly Muslims who would also know Persian.
Right.
And then in the film industry, the same kind of logics are repeated, where in the colonial language learning institution, you have a pandit who's going to be a
Yeah.
Brahmin, necessarily teaching Sanskrit to the colonial officer, and the person who knows the Persian would be the munshi, teaching
Yeah.
Persian to the colonial officer again. The same logics are replicated in Talkie studios, and munshis are hired for writing Urdu dialogues.
Hmm.
Pandits are hired for writing Hindi dialogues. So
Hmm.
there are these interesting things that have happened. But I mean, the question of literacy is also important. I
Yeah.
mean, let's be honest. I mean, I didn't really want to say that the screenwriter is a laboring body at all, because there's a significant privilege
Yeah.
around writing
Yeah.
alone,
Yeah.
because I mean, it allows you to write your memoirs, create your own histories, which I have been a beneficiary of.
Yeah.
And then you're also writing. You're not really working in a studio. And as Debushi Mukherjee has given us examples of,
Hmm.
there's an essay which I can't remember with the name of it.
Hmm.
I think it's the one on Shanta Apte that came out
Yes.
recently
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
in feminist media histories, where
Yeah.
she's talking about how these swimmers, these just die of exhaustion.
Hmm.
I'm not sure they were upper caste at all.
Yeah, because if the body is expendable, it's 100% not upper
Yeah,
caste. We know this
absolutely.
from living in a caste society. We don't have to study this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of thing is not there in screenwriting history. So in that way, I think it's quite privileged. I mean, I keep
Yeah.
calling the screenwriter a marginal figure, but that's something that is just limited to.
It's like first world marginalization, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So in a way, it's a replication of the kind of marginalization that is also true for the West, where you have so many screenwriting labor unions fighting for copyright and
Yeah.
other similar issues. So that it's kind of replication of that.
Mm.
But I wouldn't really call the screenwriter a laboring body at all. I mean, there's plenty to write, and I completely agree with you. The onus seems to be on Dalit scholars.
Yeah. It indeed it can't be. Now, as a researcher, this is a sort of niche area, and you had to find out and follow leads that aren't handed to you on a platter. So, yeah, I mean, sometimes I think that media researchers are also like we double up as spies and investigators. So, tell us something about like the thrill of discovery and something that stands out.
I mean, often in the West, you think of research happening in a very formalized kind of way. You go to the
Yeah.
archive, you encounter the archival documents, you write about them, then you think over it. And here we are just waiting for a phone call, sometimes a text to come in. I mean,
From a bureaucrat, it's always a bureaucrat first.
Absolutely. So in my case, what has happened is like I told you, I gave up on the idea of finding pre-production scripts. So I thought of doing my research in a completely different way, going more into epistemological questions rather than around film production, pre-production, rather than thinking more about how to textually analyze scripts and compare them with the films, the resultant films. So what happened in between was I discovered that there is someone called Peter Dates who is thanklessly managing and cataloging one of the richest archives of Indian cinema. It's the Bombay Talkies archive, family archive. So these are
Devika Rani.
Devaki Rani. Sorry, how can I forget it? So these are her documents
Mm.
that were with her husband, the painter Rorik.
Rorich.
Rorik,
Yeah.
yeah. So, and then they went to somebody in the US, and then the person in the US called Peter Deeds and gave it to him, gave all
Oh,
these
wow.
documents to him. So now he's working on these documents. He was also not even aware that, I mean, I think he was aware that he belonged to the film industry in some ways, because he is the great grandson of, sorry, he's the grandson of Himanshu Rai, the founder of Bombay Talkies.
Oh, wait. So
Yeah.
Peter Deeds is the
Yeah,
grandson of Himanshu Rai.
Himanshu Rai.
So he must have
Yeah.
been aware of his pedigree, yeah?
I mean, he's also become a historian in so many ways, and he's been cataloging it with mostly, I mean, single-handedly. But he also has a few people who help him out, and he's been trying. I think, so. He's based in Melbourne, and
Mm-hmm.
I had the good fortune of visiting Melbourne during this research, and I went to his archive. It was very warm. He also allowed me to take some pictures of documents and so on. So this was again a very serendipitous way of discovering some dialogue fragments that are available in his archive, not entire scripts, but which point to Bombay Talkies being a more organized and a sort of unique film studio during the time. Because again, if you think about Bombay Talkies, they had professional crew from Germany.
Yeah.
So they were making films in a different way. It was more
Yeah.
organized. And that is why these documents have also existed. That is the logic. I mean, if you're closer to the Hollywood style of filmmaking, then the scripts will be there, because
Yeah.
essentially the idea is that Hollywood studios keep the scripts.
Yeah.
Bombay studios don't keep the scripts.
Exactly.
So that is how it feeds into the logic of production. So this was one discovery.
Yeah.
Then I managed to track down Joseph David's great granddaughter. So Joseph David is also mentioned in this
Yeah.
article.
Yeah.
So he was the screenwriter for Alamara. So she is based in York in the UK.
Mhm.
So I reached out to her. She told me, see, I know that he was my great grandfather, but his diary doesn't exist. I read about his diary in some other autobiographical account, but she was not in possession of that. But months later, she suddenly emailed me saying, hey, you know what? I have just found a script written by Joseph David in the 1920s sent to Hollywood. So again,
Wow.
it reinforces what I was arguing in the, not arguing, I mean, there is other kind of evidence to
Yeah.
point to that this freelancing that was already going on
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in from within Bombay for Hollywood
Yeah.
studios, because this is a time in Hollywood, 1912, 1920, when they call it the scenario fever.
Right.
So the studio system has not been essentially established. They're still
Mm.
working around the logics. And there's a huge demand for stories, because cinema is a booming market and the
Yeah.
audience is not interested in actualities. So
Yeah.
actualities are like films, like short documentaries, workers coming out of the mill, the electrocution of an elephant and things like that. Like just the novelty of watching something on screen.
Mm.
So the people were over it. They wanted narratives. So there was a boom, and clearly Indian screenwriters were also contributing. So I have a document that testifies to that. I'm currently in possession of it. I have been requested by her to contribute it to one of the archives.
Right.
I'm not very sure about giving it to the NFAI, but let me see where I can place it. Yeah.
I am for you, my listeners. I'm just shaking my head. Don't do that. Yeah, but yeah, this is these two are really interesting kind of instances of having
Yeah.
come upon really like
And these are transnational, entirely transnational. There's
yeah.
another figure called Agajani Kashmiri.
Mm-hmm.
I have he was based in Toronto. He was a very famous screenwriter in the 1940s and 50s. Worked till the 1970s. Moved
Yeah.
to Toronto. Died there, and all his documents are there in Ontario. It's just outside Toronto, I think. So I've been in touch with his with his sons, and
Mm-hmm.
they're very accommodating, clearly. But I'm yet to visit that archive because of the pandemic and all that didn't happen. But there are these serendipitous
Right.
discoveries that have happened along the way. So the idea is to never foreclose the archive, right? We have to understand that it is a transnational form. People travel, and sometimes the conditions of the location where you're staying facilitate this kind of archival generation.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
if you're staying in Canada, maybe you think less about other sources or other things, and you are more focused on building this, because it's also a diasporic memory, right? You have
yeah.
to also leave something behind. You're uprooted.
Hmm.
Yeah, so there are these interesting things that have
Yeah, yeah.
happened.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, and these examples also like make me think of also like what you said about Peter Dates, right? That there seems to be this figure of the kind of person doing a lot of yeoman's work, thanklessly on the side, and often feeding into conventional academic work. I'm thinking of someone like Veer Chandharamse himself,
Absolutely.
who's such an important figure actually. For those of you who don't know, I mean, he's
Mhm.
someone who has done amassed incredible amounts of material on early cinema, and all of the scholars who we were talking about, any scholar worth their salt has to either consult him in person or like refer to his writing, because he in so many ways is the ultimate independent researcher on early Indian cinema. So people like this also are so important to these kind of it's also we're talking about a lack of formal configuration, right, around these assemblages, and it bleeds over into the research itself, into the historicizing and the studying itself. You people who are navigating and working through all of these different regimes of research, who are not actually part of formal administratively recognized systems. So I think that's also interesting how the research also kind of mimics the forms itself, the cultural forms being studied.
Hmm.
Just to kind of final question, I was thinking of the contemporary context in which your research becomes important, or research around this, or media archaeology or screenwriting, let's say, becomes important, is the OTT/web platform boom, right? And I'm trying to think about the what you've described in your essay, like the writing lab logic, with multiple people sitting and like writing different units of the film script under some sage type figure, the playwright/sage type figure, and like the current scenario. You've talked about it, your phrasing was to sort of set it up as a studio system versus database kind of binary. So do you want to just expand on that?
Yeah, and to just broadly give a background, and I mean, to be very honest, the period that I'm looking at, I've already mentioned this, I think, is not as rich as the contemporary. Right now, screenwriting is extremely important right now. So you'll see these film companion videos of creators sitting together with actors, and all of them keep talking about the script. This was true for, especially for Patal Lok. If you just look at the
Yeah, yeah.
discussion that we had, they couldn't stop talking. Even the actors, the directors, they couldn't stop talking about how fundamental the script was to developing this show, and that makes complete sense, right? So the general stereotype about Bombay cinema for years has been that it's a messy cultural sort of space, this cottage industry, and most films are made without scripts.
Yeah.
But with the coming of multiplexes
Yeah.
around the turn of the millennium, that perception changed significantly. The union that is there, that caters to copyright issues of screenwriters and screenwriters as in film writers and television writers, and now even content creators on YouTube. Now it's called Screenwriters Association, which was actually rechristened while my thesis was being
Oh,
written. So
okay.
I started out when it was called Film Writers Association, and now it's called Screenwriters. So they've revamped it completely. So that organization began in 1954, got registered as a labor union in 1960, and right now it's extremely important. Almost everybody who writes a script in India, especially in Bombay, because I'm sure there are other small pockets, maybe writers' organizations that facilitate the copywriting of scripts in other pockets of India. But anybody who writes a script in Bombay will register their script with the Screenwriters Association. So they have become, in terms of rights, that discourse is extremely strong right now. And even with the coming of the multiplex, what happened is there's a general emphasis, more emphasis on narrative over songs, spectacle, and
Hmm.
stardom.
Hmm.
But it did not get intensified at that moment, because the two coexisted. How I would conceptualize the contemporary, especially in terms of screenwriting, not, in terms of broader infrastructures that are there out there, would be that this is the OTT scenario is actually an extension of the multiplex, because you need it, because a multiplex needs more films, right? So it
Hmm.
needs more stories. Now a streaming platform needs, I don't know, 100 times more films to establish itself as a streaming platform. So they need content, which is something that has emerged in contemporary parlance. Otherwise, we used to call it story and screenplay and so on. But now it's content. So you have to generate that. And that's why the idea of narrative as content, as something that is essential for the creation of a streaming platform, has become very important. Screenwriting has become increasingly formalized. So the contemporary has changed quite a lot. And there is a very strange kind of promotional tactic that has emerged with the script, where you will find film stars not really, I mean, they do still use their film posters and teasers and stuff like that. But much before that, even before they've started working on a film, they'll use the script and maybe say a coffee mug.
Right.
And,
Yes.
and give you an Instagram shot of it.
Yeah.
So, we are embarking on a new production,
Yeah.
and this is the script. So the
Right.
script is also becoming more visible.
Yeah.
So there are these interesting things that are happening. And the last thing that I want to mention is what has recently emerged with the coming of the new IT rules.
Yes.
And kind of new ways in which online content is going to be regulated. So there was this dream around internet being the utopic medium, but that's clearly not. I mean, again, see, this is how the cultural and the technical interface, right? You have to take the cultural very strongly. So with that, there has been a lot of pre-censorship that is going on with these scripts, because scripts are ready for production, but now they're going over those scripts. So the scripts have become the site of pre-censorship, which is actually quite sad. So it is exciting in some ways, but it is also quite sad in
in other ways. I mean, in fact, I just did a piece for Critical Collective on this. This kind of where I'm sort of challenging this idea of the lack of statutory regulations being necessarily liberatory. Because what's also happening is it's actually making content creators more vulnerable. The law is invoked in the most malicious, malified ways, and it's actually there's a regime of policial censorship. The actual laws don't exist to prosecute anyone, but let's say you invoke the hurt sentiment or offense taking laws, and then the police just arrives and arrests people. The FIR and the petition become like these regulatory mechanisms.
And actually, Ali Abbas Zafar, who made Tandav, was the creator of Tandav, has also written something, I mean, in agreement with what you just said, that this is actually a good thing. That, I mean, now there are rules, there won't be censorship, I mean, trolling in the name of censorship.
Yeah, that's true. Policing in the name of censorship, really. Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has been really enlightening. I hope you guys go and read Rakesh's essay. It's very lucidly written, and it doesn't require any sort of great training in cinema studies to appreciate and understand it. So please do read his essay. The link to it will be in the show notes. Thanks, Rakesh. It was great talking to you.
Thank you so much again, Kamaini, for having me here. And I hope the listeners will take something away from this conversation. I mean, we've already talked about this, that academic publishing is often, I mean, it also takes time for knowledge to really come out. And we often tend to be very self-contained in academic structures. We tend to think that knowledge is supposed to be only academic, but there's always a lot of relevance outside these spaces. So I'm glad that you've started this in the first place. And thank you so much for starting this in the first place, actually. So, and it was lovely.
Thank you. This is a plug. This will be used in ads.
happy to endorse.
Thank you so much. Thank you for tuning into Artalab with Rakesh Sengupta, in which we discuss his prize-winning research on screenwriting in early Indian cinema and its contemporary relevance. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and share the episode over social media. For more information and updates, you can follow us on Instagram at art.alap and on Twitter at @RTALAAP. Before I go, I want to take a moment to send strength and support to our listeners as we in India battle the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope you and those you care about stay safe during this time. A reminder too that direct messages on Artalab's social media, Instagram and Twitter are open if you want to share resources, especially if you're an arts and culture organization wanting to spread information about relief initiatives.